Thank you for joining me, Frank Maresca, and welcome to the Russi Hive Podcast. You get the special honor of being guest number 1.
Wow, what an honor. I've never been number 1 ever in my life. This is a first.
Well, there's a first time for everything.
I guess. So what do we do now?
So what I have here, this is called the Hive card.
Hive card, I see that. Yeah.
Yes, it's basically a short snapshot of who you are. It's a way to introduce you to the audience or refresh their memory. And I'm doing this at the start of every episode. So I will read it out loud, and then you can tell me if it's right, if I missed anything, or if you want to flip it completely on its head, that's fine. And that's where our conversation really begins.
Okay, go ahead.
Frank Maresca was born in Brooklyn, New York. He began his career as a fashion and beauty advertising photographer. His passion for art collecting led him to become an art dealer and gallerist in his late 20s. From that moment on, photography and art dealing occupied equal halves of his professional life, until some 20 years ago, he devoted himself primarily to the latter. In 1979, he co-founded Ricco Maresca Gallery, which would become a pioneering force in championing vernacular, self-taught, and outsider art at a time when these fields were scarcely acknowledged by the mainstream. Over more than 4 decades, Maresca has cultivated a reputation for his legendary eye, bringing to light both named and nameless artists whose work might otherwise have gone unseen. His sensibility, at once discerning, intuitive, and unbound by convention, has shaped the way these art forms are understood, valued, and celebrated today.
Equal halves. Sounds like I'm schizophrenic. You know, we are all multiple personalities. So if I have just 2, sounds just fine to me.
It's very true.
It's a backup. The other half is a backup.
So just as a little background, I have actually interviewed you a number of times over the years, but never on camera. And we actually first met because I reached out to you when I was a graduate student here in New York, going to journalism school, and I wanted to interview you. It feels like that was 100 years ago, but I don't know how you remember it.
Well, first of all, I have almost no recollection of it. So,
Well, thank you.
So maybe, but the fact that we're still here is a good sign. So, let's get on with it.
Let's pretend this is the first time.
Let's pretend that this is the first time. So, let's start with the questioning.
Yes.
Let's start with the
Interrogation.
The interrogation.
Right. So because we've talked so much about outsider, quote, self-taught art in the past, and because I know so much about your life, I thought we would shake things up a little and start from a more personal place.
I used to be quite a good dancer when I was much younger. I like the shaking part.
Nice.
So let's shake away.
Let's start with something you've said to me more than once, and that is whatever success you've had has come about less from your creative gifts and more from your limitations. What do you mean by that?
Well, quite a famous actor by the name of Clint Eastwood, a very famous line of his, he said, a man's got to know his limitations. And I think that's very wise, and I think it's absolutely true, and it's particularly true in the case of a person who realized, mainly me, who had a lot of limitations when I was younger. I realized that there were not a lot of things that I was really good at. I was never a particularly good student. But I always gravitated toward the visual arts, and I was good. At least they told me that I was good at the visual arts. And so I said, well, gee, I really better develop that part of me because the other parts are probably not worth developing.
I've been thinking a lot about the relationship between focus and curiosity. So on one hand, there's this idea that you should always finish what you start. And that has to do with focus, I guess, with picking one thing and doing it to the best of your ability. But some breakthroughs really do happen from letting your mind wander in an open-ended way and being aware that there are different ways of achieving success, whether creative or otherwise, right?
I think that you can plan something, and you can plan something carefully, and at some point you really have to throw away the plans and just trust, and trust in what you know. And even if there's a script, you have to pretend that the script doesn't exist for some period of time and just ad lib based on everything that you've learned.
Yeah. You know, I was reading Walter Isaacson's book on Da Vinci, and one of the things that struck me was how many projects he left unfinished. One, because he was a perfectionist. Two, because his curiosity was so boundless that he just kept constantly chasing the next idea. And three, because he was good at so many things, right? Da Vinci aside, sometimes being good at many things can become a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it has to do with focus. And I know people that are far, far smarter than me, far smarter than I'll ever be. They seem to be good at absolutely everything that they try. But the fact is that they're good, and they'll probably never be great. And they'll never be great because there's just too much going on. There's too much that they want to try, like Da Vinci. Too much and not enough time. And so they start something, they take it to a certain point, and they leave it, rather than developing it as far as it could possibly be developing. Instead of creating a masterpiece, they're creating a whole bunch of beginnings of what might be a masterpiece.
Yeah, I mean, going back to Da Vinci, just to close that up, if he had devoted himself only to painting and drawing, we would have a much, much larger body of work to look at today. But at the same time, we wouldn't have sort of the picture of the genius brain that he was.
That's true, but the fact is that had he devoted himself to just painting and sculpture, the world would still know him. It's because he was such a revolutionary.
But for the rest of us, I think focus is probably a good idea.
Genius is a rare thing, and the type of genius that Da Vinci had is beyond a rare thing. It's really non-existent, otherworldly.
Yes. Do you think fear has any real use in the creative process, or is it just an obstacle?
Fear is great. I love fear. Everything that I do, for the most part, has some aspect of fear of failure to it. So because I'm petrified of failing, I make sure I do everything that I possibly can do so that I don't fail. There was an artist that we represented by the name of William Hawkins. And I've known a lot of artists. I've never known an artist, who had the lack of fear that William Hawkins had. And I think that was the fuel, really, that propelled him. He was afraid of nothing. He thought that he had a huge ego. This was a person with less than a third grade education, and yet he knew that he had a talent. He knew that he had a gift. He believed in himself completely. And watching him work just, I guess, taught me something about being fearless, even though I couldn't necessarily put that I learned into practice. I was with my business associate, Roger Ricco, and we were visiting William Hawkins in Columbus, Ohio, and I was watching him paint. The two of us were watching him paint for the first time. You know, as usual, he was paying virtually no attention to us. He had his back turned to us and was working on a piece of masonite, pouring quarts of paint onto the masonite. He had one, if you could call it a brush, he had a stick with a ferrule on it, a collar, a metal collar, that was at one time a brush, but the bristles were all gone. So it was really just a stick with a metal collar. And he'd pour the paint onto the masonite, and he'd tip the board left, and he'd tip the board right, and he'd take this stick, and he'd kind of push, cajole the paint around. And little by little, the blobs of paint all of a sudden started turning into something. It started turning into an animal. And it was amazing. It was really amazing. I don't think Roger Ricco or myself said anything, but at that point, William Hawkins half turned to us. He called us the boys. I don't think he ever, even though we knew him for a lot of years, I don't think he really ever knew our names. He just called us the boys. And he just said, see that, boys? The painting's making itself. And it's a story that I like to tell. And it's an absolutely true story. I think what William Hawkins was really saying is that you have to trust your instincts. You have to trust your talent. You have to trust something that is not necessarily something that is academic. You have to trust something that you're born with. William Hawkins also used to say that every child has a gift. And I also believe that that's true. And certainly William Hawkins had a gift. It was the instinctive gift of art that did not come out of the academy. At that point in time, William Hawkins was probably either 89 or 90 years old, and it came from life experience, and learning how to use that life experience and how to translate that life experience into the visual arts.
Yeah, and he also didn't have that crippling fear that many artists have of being judged, of failure, what if this doesn't work out? You know, there was none of that in Hawkins's process.
Yeah, I mean, there was none of that because he completely trusted and believed. He had a belief in what he was doing, and because he had a very large ego, it never even entered his mind that anything that he was doing was less than great. If he was doing it, it was great, period.
Now let's go back in time a lot. Many, many years.
Well, God knows I have enough years to go back on.
Can you give us a quick picture of how you were as a kid? And I will give you a few pointers. So, Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, Italian parents, Coney Island, early collector, Uncle Fred, Professor Sputnik, and famous monsters of Filmland.
Well, that's my whole life. Might as well go home now. So, of that very long list, what would you like to know about?
Well, you could string those things together. So let's start with Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, and Italian parents.
Yes, it's true. I was born in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. And yes, it's true. I had first generation. No, I guess I'm first generation, technically. Both of my parents were born in Italy. So they were immigrant parents, even though my mom came over here when she was, I believe, 9 months old. And my father came here after World War One. One, not World War Two.
Not two.
World War One. He rode on a horse. He was actually in the cavalry.
On a white horse,
On a white horse. And so that was the beginning. I guess you could say that was the beginning. That was the
So
beginning.
you grew up in Bensonhurst, Italian parents, near Coney Island, which is a very important part of your childhood.
I love Coney Island.
You love Coney Island, Carnival, everything.
I love carnivals.
Yes. And we see that a lot in what you've done with the gallery, I think. The kinds of objects that you handle and the shows that you've curated. And then you were also an early collector of things, of different things, fossils, stamps, what else?
Yeah.
Coins.
True. I was always a collector. I don't know why. I was always a collector. It probably had somewhat to do with the fact that, like a lot of people, I'm OCD, hopefully. I've made some of that OCD work in my favor rather than against me. So collecting, I would assemble, various things, whether they were baseball cards, whether they were rocks, whether they were marbles, whether they were plastic charms from a vending machine. And I would collect them and I would learn about them and I would organize them. So I think that pretty much set the scene for at least who I am right now, putting aside my life as a photographer, which maybe was not as related, but still, I'm sure you can find a connection.
And then there was Uncle Fred.
Uncle Fred.
Who died when you were quite young. He was around for maybe a few years in your childhood.
Died when I was 7.
He died when you were 7, but he has a lasting influence.
I think my formative years were I would call my Uncle Fred years. I had a father who was, essentially a workaholic that opened his business at 3 o'clock in the morning. And he usually came back in the early evening, very tired.
This was a wholesale olive oil business.
In Tribeca on Franklin Street, which was known as Washington Markets. Now, clearly one of the most fashionable neighborhoods in the city. But back then, there was nothing but wholesale food vendors there. Uncle Fred sort of became kind of a surrogate dad to me. He was someone that it seemed really did not work very often. He had a connection with the Museum of Natural History. I'm still to this day unclear as to exactly what his job might have been with the Museum of Natural History. The only thing I know is that he often took me on very personal tours of the Museum of Natural History, sort of back rooms and basements and that sort of thing, when I was a child, when I was 5 years old, 6 years old.
And he was also a collector.
He was definitely a collector, a classic collector. He lived with my Aunt Jo in a brownstone in Brooklyn. And I remember there was one room in the brownstone that was just completely filled with copies of National Geographic magazine from the very beginning, just virtually piled up to the ceiling. And then there were cabinets that were full of preserved specimens in what I imagine was formaldehyde, whether they were snakes or whether they were bugs or they were botanical specimens. And then there were other areas that were, he liked African art, figures and masks, and there was a whole collection of African art. And then there was what I would call a sub-collection of objects that were, it seemed to me, of sort of either German or Viennese origin, kind of Art Deco or slightly pre-Art Deco. But the fact is, he was a collector. He was fascinated by the natural world, and he was fascinated by the unnatural world. All of these years later, it probably happened when I was 5, 6, 7 years old. We were actually going to Coney Island, I believe, and we were waiting on a train, outdoor platform, train station. And while we were waiting for the train, all of a sudden, there was this rather gigantic, very, very green praying mantis. So here was this giant green, otherworldly insect crawling on the outdoor train platform. And Uncle Fred, who always wore a hat, without saying anything, he just reached down, he picked up the giant praying mantis, and he put it under his hat. I couldn't believe it. I thought it was the most amazing thing that I had ever seen ever in my life. I was amazed. I was horrified. I didn't know what to think. And now, as I recall, we were headed to Prospect Park. And there the praying mantis sat on the train under his hat. And when we got to Prospect Park, he found an appropriate spot and released the praying mantis onto Prospect Park. I don't know how it changed my life, but I think that moment changed my life.
Like a magic trick.
Sort of, except it was real.
Yes. That must have been...
It actually happened, and I'm prone to exaggeration. Everyone knows that I'm prone to exaggeration. But if anything, I'm under-exaggerating. I mean, I could go on about praying mantises, but I won't.
Good. So another thing that I want to touch on is that growing up, I know you were a lover of sci-fi and monster films. And I feel like they have, in a way, shaped the choices that you've made later, particularly as a collector and as a gallerist.
Last night, I watched Creature from the Black Lagoon. I've probably seen it, I don't know how many times. I've certainly seen it 25 times. I never grow tired of it, even though the creature was wearing a rubber suit. Whether it was the creature of the Black Lagoon, or whether it was Frankenstein, or whether it was the Bride of Frankenstein, or the Wolfman, or Dracula, or the Mummy, they were all important figures in my life. To me, they were real.
Maybe it's the otherness, the unknown factor, the mystery.
Magic and mystery. The two things that kind of rule my life.
And then one day you went to see a Hitchcock film, Rear Window, and you expected a horror film. Instead, you found James Stewart and playing a photographer and beautiful Grace Kelly. And then what?
It was at a movie theater called the Highway Theater in Brooklyn. And I somehow heard that Alfred Hitchcock made horror films. What did I know? I thought this was a monster horror film. Rear Window. What was going to happen? I didn't know what was going to happen. Who was seeing what outside of a rear window? I was hoping that it was some kind of a monster, that a bat would fly through the window, or Dracula would come in, or suddenly the mummy would appear, or the wolf man. Or it had to be something like that. And that, in fact, is not at all what happened. What happened was Jimmy Stewart, who was playing a photojournalist photographer who had broken his leg, was in a wheelchair, in a cast, with binoculars or with a telephoto lens, looking at his neighbors because he couldn't leave his apartment, had nothing else to do.
A little voyeurism going on there, yes.
Yeah. But we're all, everyone given a chance will look. How many people will turn away? Almost no one. So in any event, that's what he was. And all of a sudden, it's evening in this West Village apartment, and the door opens, and in comes Grace Kelly, and she begins to turn on lights in the apartment. And then the camera goes into a slow-mo mode, and you see Grace Kelly's, mostly her head, slowly coming up to Jimmy Stewart, and she kisses Jimmy Stewart. Wow. Whoa. This is clearly not the Wolfman, Frankenstein. This is not a horror film. Maybe I was 11, 12, somewhere in that vicinity. Probably at that moment, I said to myself, I'm going to become a photographer, and I'm going to get my own Grace Kelly.
Going back to the kind of professional decisions that you made early on, you've said before that the fear of ending, back to fear again.
I'm always afraid of something.
The fear of ending up broke kept you from pursuing the editorial route in photography, and instead you became an advertising, fashion and beauty photographer, which was safer, I guess. Do you regret that?
I don't regret it at all. I left home at a really early age. My parents, mostly my father, had been encouraging me to become a dentist.
I don't see it.
And he had been encouraging me to be a dentist because our family neighborhood dentist, Dr. Fishman, drove a Mercedes-Benz. I don't know that I'd ever seen a Mercedes-Benz in my life. I had no knowledge of what that represented. Status symbol, driving an expensive foreign car. But the fact is, Dr. Fishman had a Mercedes. And my father would always say to me, whenever I told him that I loved photography and I wanted to become a photographer, he would say, if you become a dentist, you'll be secure for the rest of your life. And then if you want to do photography as a hobby, you can do photography as a hobby.
Clearly, you didn't do that.
Clearly.
But you also you didn't go the route that a lot of other artists from your generation took, which was going off to Paris, London, Milan, and kind of living day to day, shooting as much as they could, and then building a portfolio, coming back here, and then sort of starting their editorial career in that way. You just went straight to business, essentially, for yourself.
I suppose a lot of it had to do with the practicality of my parents, and really drilled into me not to take chances, to be stable, to have a base. And from that base, you can jump off and do whatever the hell you want to do. So I never went to Europe. I stayed in New York, and little by little by little, I became an advertising photographer. At first, before becoming an advertising photographer, I pursued the same route as Jimmy Stewart pursued in Rear Window, and became a photographer for Time magazine and traveled around, as a working photojournalist. While I appreciated photojournalism, certainly, and still do, it wasn't really what I wanted to do. I always wanted to photograph fashion and beauty.
I also want to hear about the craft part of it, like especially the darkroom. What was the process like for you? How did you use it to achieve what people do today in Photoshop and Lightroom?
The darkroom was dark, and it was mysterious, and there were chemicals. So there was an alchemy about the whole thing, as I did not say earlier. In Brooklyn, in my basement, I had a laboratory, and it was a made-up laboratory. I guess, again, at a reasonably early age, I had a sense of the dramatic, and I had the visual ability to put things together, things like glassware, and fill the glassware with colored liquid, and take pieces of dry ice and put it in the colored liquid so that it bubbled. It was all show. There was no chemistry. There was no science at all. It was just pure theater. But I did have that in Brooklyn, and I loved that. And so the darkroom became kind of an offshoot or continuation of that. I was able to be in a darkened room with what's called a safe light, or a red, orangey light on, illuminating. I could work with chemicals. And instead of the chemicals doing nothing, the chemicals actually made things happen. They made images that were what's called a latent image, an image that you can't see, all of a sudden appear like magic. You would take a seemingly blank piece of paper and put it under this liquid chemical in a sink and move the tray around, rock the tray. And as you rock the tray, all of a sudden, an image would come to life.
Do you think that working in the darkroom gave you a discipline and a sensitivity that photographers working today digitally perhaps don't have?
No, I think it's just different. I mean, I look at people that are sort of very accomplished in the digital arena. They're doing things that I could never do. But by the same token, if I were in a darkened room with chemicals, I'm doing things that they could never do, that they would consider alchemy, really. And what they're doing is sort of digital alchemy to me. It's kind of a mystery. Anyone that knows me knows that I'm a complete cave person when it comes to the digital arena. I know less than nothing. I love my iPhone, but there's almost nothing that I can do except send texts and emails and receive them. Other than that, there's nothing that I can do. I know that the iPhone is more powerful than the mainframe computers that sent the first man to the moon. That completely, totally amazes me and tells me how much I don't know.
Yeah, Apple could use that as advertisement.
They should.
So moving on to your life as an art collector, collectors like you, driven by passion, are rare in an art world that often prioritizes the name of the artist over the work itself. I don't want to generalize, but it feels like that's what happens a lot of the time. What has guided you differently?
Well, the names, as I've said before, the names don't really mean anything to me. The only thing that means anything to me is content, message. Someone could have a gigantic name, and I might look at the work. I may love the work, but it may leave me cold. There may be sort of nothing going on there for me somehow. And I think that somehow goes back to when I was 5 or 6 or 7 years old. And I have to think that a chunk of it has to do with my Uncle Fred and what he liked and what he introduced me to, and setting limitations for myself, concentrating on a thing. Someone else might have a revelation regarding something that I have no particular interest in. Art is a very personal thing. It's sort of like a diary in a way. And the more intimate the diary is, the closer to the bone, the stronger the art is.
You are just done with a book on your collection, and the title is Seeing and Believing, which I think connects to that, right? It's not seeing a name, it's seeing something that has an impact on you, that has a power, that has a visual presence. And
Seeing that something that has no name.
yes.
You're seeing, and you're being influenced by that which is in front of you rather than a biography. You're not influenced by what other people have said about something, because in a way it's sort of a vacuum.
Going off of that, I'd like to talk about the tension between appreciation and possession, and what it means to simply love a work of art versus needing to own it and live with it.
I need to possess art. Is that a good thing, a bad thing? I don't know. It is what it is. It's who I am. I need to possess the art. Certainly, I spend a fair amount of time in museums, and it's both wonderful. When I see a great museum show, it's both wonderful and difficult for me. Because if what I'm looking at really moves me, really speaks to me, I basically want to take that work, that object, that whatever it is, I want to take it and I want to make it part of my life. I want to take it home with me. It's like meeting a person that you're so completely drawn to, and you want that person to be with you forever, and you want to take that person home. I think of art in the same way.
In a fantasy world, if you had to live with one work of art, regardless of whether it's academic, outsider, self-taught, whatever it is, nameless, named, what would it be?
It's impossible to answer. It changes all the time. It can change from day to day. It can change from week to week. It can change from year to year. You feel a certain way at a particular moment in time. My appetite, if you want to call it that, for art and for the history of art is, I like to think, so broad. I go to the Met all the time. There's a fragment, an Egyptian fragment, a queen. Maybe the queen is Nefertiti. They're not really sure. But it's a yellow jasper fragment. It's about the size of a grapefruit or so. And I've always been drawn to it. And I always think whenever I stand in front of it, which is really pretty often, I say to myself, if I could possess this somehow, some way, what would it take? Of course, it's impossible. What would it take to possess this?
If that fragment ever goes missing, then we know.
They'd have to come and they'd probably look for me first.
So most people would have probably started with the gallery, but I wanted to save it for last. You've shaped it into this living environment, part theater, part discovery lab, part reflection of your own history and style. After 4 decades, what does this space represent to you?
Well, it represents all of those things. I like to think that the gallery represents who I am now and who I was years ago when I was 5 years old and 6 years old and 7 years old. And moving forward, not necessarily who I will be, because I'll probably be dead, but what will it mean to others? Whatever it is that Ricco Maresca Gallery has contributed, I like to think that that contribution, as small as it might be, could become part of art history and could benefit others, could pave the way for people that will take things further than I've been able to take them in the 40 or so years that I've been in this business.
Isn't it wild to think that if you had listened to your father's advice and become a dentist, none of this, including us, would be here?
I probably would have made a pretty excellent dentist.
You think?
Because of my attention to detail. But frankly, the concept of staring into a mouth, different mouths every day, I understand that the suicide rate amongst dentists are really quite high.
Okay, so on that very appealing note, that's it. We did it. And with your blessing, the podcast is launched.
When I see it, I'll believe it. It's kind of an other take on the title of the new book.
That's correct.
If I can plug the book.
That's correct. Well, thank you. Thank you again for joining me.
It was my pleasure, and I hope yours and others as well.